Hello, welcome to Chapter 4. I'm Roberta Lavin, and I will be your professor for this course. Let's get started. The learning objectives for this chapter are to understand the purpose of a problem statement, describe the elements and attributes of a purpose statement, describe the purpose of a research question, explain how a research question varies for qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research, explain the purpose of a hypothesis and what hypothesis testing means, and critical appraisal of research problem, question, and hypothesis. As a nurse, there are many problems to solve. One common problem faced by nurses is medication errors. As a profession, we have searched for ways to solve the problem and have been offered tools to help improve accuracy. With little or no evidence, the tools will help reduce either the frequency or severity of medication errors. In 2022, Redonda Vaught was convicted of criminal negligent homicide and abuse of an impaired patient. She mistakenly gave a 75-year-old female patient a fatal dose of Vecurium instead of Versed that had been ordered. This sad case is one example of why nurses hope to find a good idea that will result in fewer medication errors. That's how research works. Other things that you might consider that would make a good research question might be nurse burnout during COVID, the side effects of a treatment, or falls. What do we do when we want to learn more about a problem we face as a nurse? We do research. What are the characteristics of a good research question? It explores the relationship between two or more variables. It is stated in the form of a question, and it must indicate empirical evidence. In this chapter, we're going to start thinking about how to write a good research question, and thus how we make the question testable. Is this a testable question? The more hours nurses work in a shift, the greater the number of medication errors. Work hours and medication errors can both be measured, and work hours can be manipulated. Even with a testable problem, work hours may not be the only factor that influences medication errors. What then? Let's think more about the case study that's presented in your book. It does provide an example of how to add a little more detail to addressing medication errors by also addressing the level of experience of nurses. We're going to get to that in just a minute, but a problem statement offers an argument explaining the need for a study, but it is not a standalone sentence. It should lead the reader to the author's perception of the issue that needs discussion and what the proposed solution is. A problem statement has some elements that are important to it. First of all, the status quo. It tells the reader how things are and why they should change their approach or actions. It is important to begin with how things are so that everyone is on the same page as far as understanding, which will make it easier to make a case for change. You want to give some background, and in the background, begin by demonstrating a need and showing the inadequacies of the status quo. Then you identify how big the problem is and what the cost will be if the problem is not addressed. You have the so what section. The problem statement should always address the so what question. Why is it important, and why should others care? You want to know about the consequences, and it is not always about the numbers. Most people are not convinced by numbers, and we know that. We know that statistics don't actually often convince people that are already convinced of whatever the opposite is. But people need to know how something will benefit them, the consequences or the cost may have on them. This is not just the cost of fixing a problem, but the cost of not fixing a problem. And then finally, you need a solution. What information is missing, and how will the proposed study address the knowledge gaps and eliminate the perceived problems? Let's go back to talking about that case study. The case study is Perceptions of Patient Safety, Culture, and Medication Error Reporting among Early and Mid-Career Female Nurses in South Korea. The full citation is listed here. This is an open access article, so you can Google it and quickly pull it up. Do that, and then let's take a look at it and walk through it. The first paragraph provides the status quo. Here is the status quo. You will notice that patient safety is recognized as pivotal of health quality and is receiving global attention to prevent. You can go on and further see that delivering safe care reduces adverse outcomes, such as long hospital stays. And you can see that patient safety culture is crucial to the organization. And finally, establishing a robust patient safety culture has been found to significantly reduce the number of medication errors or medical errors. This is the status quo. Paragraph 2 provides background and the inadequacies that exist. So, medication errors have significant implications for patient safety and care. Medication errors are among the most common healthcare errors in South Korea, and I would think that probably in most of the world. Previous studies have reported the rates of medication errors. One study suggested, you notice below this, one study suggested that the electronic incident reporting system of 50.8% of hospitals reported medication errors. Another study reported. So you're seeing what the problem is, what one study's reported, now you're seeing what another's reported. Hence, reporting is extremely important. This is the background and the inadequacies of the status. Paragraphs 3 and 4 answer the so what question and identify continued consequences of not addressing the problem. It starts out with today the organizational level hospitals strive for quality care. It goes on to the next, but fear of being blamed was considered the main barrier. And then high turnover rates of nurses and low staffing levels are a threat to patient safety. And finally, despite the importance of error communication, the actual amount of error reporting is lower than the number of actual medication errors. This all gives us the so what. It tells us why it's important. The last paragraph of the introduction offers the solution that will fill the gaps in knowledge. Many articles do this in 1 or 2 paragraphs, but it is not uncommon to see the problem statement woven throughout the article. When you are analyzing an article, it's always a good idea to take time to walk through it slowly and identify each component. You can see here that although reporting error system was common, that there is still underreporting and it still persists. you see that there are a few studies that examine the relationship between nursing perception of safety and medication errors. You see that finally this study compares the association between perceptions. So now you're getting to what the study does. This gives you the solution that fills the gap in the knowledge. The solution is this study compares the association between this variable and that variable. The purpose statement establishes the goal of a research study, and unlike the problem statement, almost always clearly identifies it is the purpose statement by stating, the purpose of this study is. In most articles, this is the last paragraph of the introduction or before the methods section, and is the most important the most important statement in the study. The purpose statement elements and attributes are a central phenomenon, a definition, population, research site, research design, scope, free of bias, and avoiding ambiguity. Let's think a little bit about this. So the central phenomenon, this is the big idea that you want to understand. The wording should include action verbs and should be non-directional. The definition provides a tentative definition of the phenomenon that makes clear that it is to help understand the study. The population is the population or the participants you are wanting to study. This could be, the population could be all patients in the hospital that experience a medication error. It could be all hospitalized patients. It could be all people with diabetes. The research site is obviously where the research is done. The research design is when you identify the research strategy and whether the study will be a certain type of research. In qualitative, it could be ethnographic, phenomenological, or an experimental design. You could have a randomized controlled trial, for example. The scope identifies any limits of the study, locations, or the participants. All studies need to be free of bias, and it's hard to avoid absolutely all bias. But you do need to avoid terms that indicate bias, such as prove or demonstrate. Words like this kind of imply that you already know what answer you want. And then you want to be clear. Don't be ambiguous. Using terms that lead the reader not knowing if it is non-experimental or experimental design is not a good idea. You want people to know exactly what you are doing. Let's think about this exercise. Find any research article and see if you can identify all the elements of the purpose. When you've finished, come back to the video. How many of you found an article with all the elements? In my experience, it's only about 50-50. A lot of times, all the elements are not included in articles. Sometimes this is due to sloppiness. Other times it's due to space. And you have a limitation on words in the article. And when people start cutting after they're ready to publish, sometimes important things can get cut. Formulation of a good research question from the research problem is a dynamic process and the first step in starting a research study. I'm going to present to you two ways to think about this. First, what should the process of writing a research question lead to? And I think it should lead to a clear, concise, focused, complex, arguable, and interesting research question. If you want a clear research question, one way to do this is to start out with a PICO or a PICO-T question. The scope of the question needs to be narrow enough that you're able to answer it and it's achievable. If you make it too broad, your study's too big and you're not going to be able to do it. So be focused, be specific, not too broad, not too general. It's like the three bears, just right. It needs to be complex. It cannot be answered with a yes or no question. It needs to be arguable. It should be measurable and possible to produce an analysis of the problem. And finally, it's going to take up a lot of your time and effort, so it better be interesting. If you bore yourself right off the bat, that is not a good start. One of the ways to think about it is called Finer Maps that I read about in an article by Rattan and colleagues. And in this way, the research question drives the entire research process. So characteristics of a good research question are important since they are driving your process. And in Finer Maps, it needs to be feasible, and which is to say it has to be doable. It can't cost more money than you have to spend on it. It can't take more time than you have. It must be in a place that you have access to, things like that. Feasible. Has to be interesting, which we just talked about, because if you're boring yourself, you're going to bore everybody else. It needs to be novel. You don't want to do something that has been done before. So you want a clear, concise question, and it should indicate the scope of what's to be investigated. Although it can confirm or refute an existing study, it should attempt to find something new. All research needs to be ethical, and it needs to be approved by an institutional review board. It needs to protect private information, maintain the privacy of the people that participate in it, and anybody in a research study must have the right to withdraw from the study. Needs to be relevant. The research should be of interest to the people in the field that you are studied and based on existing literature and clinical practice, and it should fill existing gaps. It needs to be manageable, which is another way of saying it needs to be feasible within the time available and the ability of the researcher to manage the process. There are two things to consider here. First is time, but the other is it within your capability as a researcher? So an experienced researcher may have a research project that is more complex. Too complex for a novice researcher. That needs to be considered. It needs to be appropriate, so the question needs to be logical and scientific. It needs to offer potential value. We don't do research just to do research because we want to. It has to offer some value that impacts those people who choose to participate. And it needs to be systematic, which means you need to follow a systematic, stepwise approach. It cannot be haphazard. Somebody has to be able to replicate what you did as a researcher. Next, we're going to think a little bit about the hypothesis. The hypothesis further explains the problem and the purpose and elucidates expected outcomes. Understanding the difference between a problem statement and a hypothesis requires you recall the difference between a declarative sentence and an interrogatory sentence. A declarative sentence makes a statement about facts, offers an explanation, and relays information. An interrogative sentence asks a direct question. So a hypothesis is a formal statement of expected relationships between two or more variables in a specified population. How do we get there? A well-developed hypothesis sets the stage for generating knowledge through the testing and analysis of theoretical statements and relationships. You will only find a hypothesis in quantitative research because in qualitative research, the process is guided by the perspective of the participants. This is a checklist for you of elements that you should have in a hypothesis. Questions you should be able to answer. Is it testable? You have to be able to identify variables and have some way of manipulating the variables. The terminology needs to be correct. We need to be really precise with the words we use and what they mean. The research question. Ask yourself, does a hypothesis clearly relate to the research question? You might be surprised how often researchers stray from what the hypothesis was. You need to be clear, concise, and free of bias. You need to know if there's prior research. Is the hypothesis based in that prior research? Is it published in the literature? Can you locate it? You need to know what the population is that is being studied. You need to be able to identify the variables and the expected relationships or differences between the variables, which means the variables must be measurable. You need to know the type of research. Is the type of research clearly indicated? And then finally, as methodological techniques, does the methodology direct the conduct of the research, including design, sampling, data collection, analysis, and interpretation? Here's an example. Nurses with high perceived culture of safety have lower rates of failure to report medication errors. The independent variables are perceived culture of safety. The dependent variable is rate of failure to report medication errors. This is directional research using a non-experimental design. There are 4 different types of hypotheses: simple or complex, directional or non-directional, associative or causal, and null or alternative. A simple hypothesis shows a relationship, positive or negative, between an independent and a dependent variable. A complex hypothesis shows a relationship between multiple independent and dependent variables. A directional hypotheses predict the relationship among variables, whereas non-directional hypothesis has no theory and does not state a relationship among variables, but does not predict the direction. Associative or causal. In associative hypothesis, there is a change in one variable that results in a change in another variable, but does not indicate the variable that had an impact on the other. In causal hypothesis, a change in one variable causes a change in the other. And finally, null and alternative, which is what we hear about most frequently. A null hypothesis is a negative statement that predicts there is no significant relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. The alternative hypothesis essentially states the opposite, states that there is a significant relationship between the independent and dependent variables, and it disproves the null hypothesis. Hypotheses need to be tested using statistical analysis to draw a conclusion about the population based on the data collected. Hypothesis testing is the process used to evaluate the strength of the evidence from the sample and provides a framework for making determinations related to the population. The determination allows the researcher to reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Again, if we treat this like a whodunit in a mystery of who killed the maid at the trial, there are only two possible truths. Either the defendant killed the maid, or it was not proven the defendant killed the maid. You notice that this is not the same as saying the defendant is innocent. Hypothesis testing evaluates the strength of evidence from the sample and provides a framework for making determinants about the relationships of the variables and the population. This determination allows researchers to accept or reject the null hypothesis. This flows in a process. You start by stating the hypothesis. You then set the significance, and the significance level is usually set at a p of 0.05, although sometimes it is set at a p of 0.01, and this is the number that is used to either accept or reject the null hypothesis. You then collect your data, and you basically conduct a study and collect all the data from the population you are studying. Then you assess the evidence and you do your statistical test. And finally, you make conclusions. If the p is less than 0.05, then you reject the null hypothesis. If the p is greater than 0.05, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. Remember the maid in the murder mystery? Again, if we treat this like the whodunit with the maid, either the defendant killed the maid or it was not proven the defendant killed the maid. There is no such thing as saying the defendant is innocent. This ends chapter 4. I hope you are starting to think like a scientist. Again, you know when my office hours are and how to contact me.